We're having an executive session and markup on several pieces of legislation and an important rail safety hearing that we're looking forward to hearing from witnesses and our colleagues about what we need to do to improve rail safety in the United States of America. We're meeting today to consider 5 important bipartisan bills. We will not be considering the nomination of Phil Washington. We are moving that to a future date pending information that members have been seeking. The 5 bills we will consider are from our colleagues. We know the first legislation from the NOTAM outage in January that we must swiftly modernize the FAA's NOTAM system and put true redundancy in place to prevent future disruptions. The NOTAM Improvement Act of 2023, introduced by Senators Klobuchar, Moran, and Capito, pushes forward this critical modernization effort and addresses a related NTSB recommendation on improving and disseminating of information to pilots. I support Senator Klobuchar's amendments to set clear deadlines for fully implementing the federal NOTAM system, including the necessary backup. This would give more certainty to both Congress and the aviation industry as we work together to determine funding and resources necessary to complete this important work. I'm pleased to see we are also doing the Informed Consumers and Smart Device Act. Senator Cruz suggested that we work together on this back in November, and this legislation enjoys bipartisan support. It says if a device collects audio or video information, manufacturers need to let you know what it is doing before you buy it or bring it to your home. And I thank Senator Cruz for his leadership on this legislation. In January, Senator Grassley and I reintroduced the Pharmacy Benefit Manager Transparency Act, a bill that we passed out of committee last year to shine a bright light on drug pricing in the marketplace and to prevent unfair and deceptive practices by PBMs that drive up the cost of medications. Drug prices have been increasing at an alarming rate and are compromising consumers, their budgets, and the cost of health plans. The pharmacy benefit managers are middlemen in the drug pricing supply chain, and today 3 PBMs control 80% of the prescription drug market, operating out of the view of regulators. This committee has heard testimony showing how PBMs' substantial market power and opaque practices impact patients, providers, and pharmacies, including a Seattle pharmacist who had to close a pharmacy serving retirees because the PBM clawback had over $538,000 in just a single year. So I look forward to moving this out of committee again. The committee will also consider bipartisan Save Our Ocean Seas 2.0 Act, sponsored by Senators Sullivan, Whitehouse, Peters, and Menendez. In 2020, the Save Our Seas Act established a Marine Debris Foundation to build upon existing federal initiatives aimed at cleaning up our oceans. It is important that we get this foundation working and engage with federally recognized tribes on this important issue. I support Senator Sullivan's amendment and thank him for his leadership on this. And our last bill today is the markup in the Cadets Act, sponsored by Senator Peters, Young, Cruz, Baldwin, Klobuchar, Braun, and Markey. This bill aims to expand the age eligibility for important financial assistance benefits benefiting the state maritime academies. This bill will help incentivize more workers to enter the merchant marine and provide new opportunities to support our veterans and grow our maritime workforce. And with that, I turn to our colleague, the ranking member, Senator Cruz, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning. I'm glad we're having the first markup together of the new Commerce Committee, and I'm looking forward to the next 2 years together. Today, we're going to be voting on 5 bills, and I'm grateful to Chairwoman Cantwell and her staff for working with me and my staff to move several bipartisan bills in this markup. 2 of the bills I want to briefly mention. First, I'm very pleased that we'll be marking up the Informing Consumers About Smart Devices Act, which is a bill that I introduced along with Chair Cantwell. This important bill will help ensure that the privacy and security of American households remains intact. As the number of smart devices found in homes steadily climbs, consumers deserve greater transparency about how these devices work and how they impact your privacy. Americans should know if their fridge is recording their family's words and movements, and they should know whether their virtual assistant is transmitting audio recordings of private family conversations. Second, I'm also pleased that we'll be marking up the Cadets Act, which I was glad to introduce with Senator Peters. This bill will help our state maritime academies, including Texas A&M Maritime Academy, to train more veterans so that they can continue to serve our nation as mariners. Last, let me say that I am glad to hear that the committee is delaying consideration of the nomination of Phil Washington. Phil Washington has been before this committee for some time now, and I think every member of this committee knows that Mr. Washington is not qualified for the position for which he is nominated. The head of the FAA is a specialized technical job that by statute requires someone learned in aviation. Mr. Washington has never flown a plane. He was never a military pilot. He was never a commercial pilot. He's never worked at an airline. He's never worked at the FAA. He's never worked as an air traffic controller. He's never worked at a company that manufactures planes. He's never worked at a company that repairs planes. One member of this committee commented to me very simply, "Nice man, not qualified." I think senators on both sides of the aisle here understand that's a serious problem. When millions of Americans trust the FAA to keep their families safe, we want someone leading the FAA with the expertise to do so. I also think the administration has an easy and clear path in front of it. Acting Administrator Billy Nolan has all of the experience that Mr. Washington lacks. He has decades in aviation. He has decades in aviation safety. He has multiple certifications in aviation safety. He's a pilot. He was the choice of President Biden to be acting administrator. So obviously the White House has some degree of confidence in him because they gave him the position of acting administrator. And as I suggested at a previous hearing, if the White House were to withdraw Mr. Washington and nominate Mr. Nolan, both Mr. Washington and Mr. Nolan are African American. The difference is Mr. Nolan has the experience we should require in that position. If the White House were to withdraw Mr. Washington and nominate Mr. Nolan, I have every confidence that this committee would move that nomination swiftly and that he would be confirmed with a substantial bipartisan vote. And given the importance of keeping the flying public safe, given multiple near misses we're seeing across this country, I believe the White House and this committee should move swiftly to ensure we have a qualified Senate-confirmed leader at the FAA.
Well, thank you, Senator Cruz. I'd like to move to the markup, but I will say that we will have this debate in the future. Mr. Washington is qualified. He has the support of other former heads of the FAA who also were not pilots, and they did very good jobs and were respected by people, including people like Ray LaHood he was at the Transportation Administration, but former group of administrators who were also not pilots, and they have supported his nomination. Jane Garvey being one of them, who had a very similar experience coming from Boston Airport and did a great job. Okay, so I will turn to my colleagues now for a recognition on the markup. So I think it's Senator Markey will make a motion.
Madam Chair, I move that S-127, the Pharmacy Benefit Manager Transparency Act of 2023, as amended by the Cantwell substitute, as modified Bud 1, as modified by Bud 2, as modified by Bud 3, as modified by Cruz 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, and Tester 1 be reported favorably.
Is there a second?
Support.
Okay. We expect amendments. I want to thank my colleagues for working on the amendments that were accepted that Senator Markey just spoke to as modifications. Senator Cruz, would you like to offer an amendment?
Madam Chair, I would like to call up Cruz Amendment number 2 to S-127. One of the concerns that I've raised and others have raised is the issue of vertical integration and consolidation within the PBM market. And I know that many of my colleagues share this concern about how just 3 PBMs control over 80% of the market. One of the issues that we discussed at the hearing on this bill, and our witness, Dr. Mulligan in particular, talked about, was how additional regulations and enforcement could end up benefiting the big PBMs who can comply with the additional burdens at the expense of the small PBMs. In other words, that this legislation could end up making it worse and prompt further consolidation. And I'm also concerned that additional FTC enforcement actions under this bill could reduce the ability of smaller PBMs to compete and compete effectively. If we want consumers to benefit, we want lots of competitions. This amendment's very simple. It exempts PBMs with an HHI index, which is the FTC measure of market presence, that is less than 200 using adjusted prescription claims in the PBM market. That corresponds to roughly a 14% market share. So this would ensure that this bill only targets the three largest PBMs that together have 80% of the market, and it allows the smaller PBMs to operate with less burdens, with more ability to innovate and compete, which I think will be beneficial to the consumers.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. Opposing your amendment, Senator Grassley and I have worked hard on this legislation for a long period of time, and the point is to outlaw behavior that we think is important, not in the marketplace where you don't have transparency. So it doesn't make sense for us to let anybody out of that behavior. It's unlawful conduct, whether they're small or large, and PBMs are masters at creating new business entities just to escape accountability. We've seen PBMs create offshore groups, purchasing organizations, so creating a business exemption just provides another way for large PBMs to spin off to smaller entities to evade accountability. So with that, I think you want a roll call vote?
Yes, please.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Klobuchar?
No.
No. Mr. Schatz?
No.
Mr. Markey?
No.
Mr. Peters?
No.
Ms. Baldwin? No. Ms. Duckworth?
No.
Mr. Tester? No. Ms. Sinema?
No.
Ms. Rosen? No. Mr. Lujan?
No.
Mr. Hickenlooper?
No by proxy.
Mr. Warnock?
No.
Mr. Welch? No. Mr. Cruz?
Aye.
Mr. Thune?
Aye.
Mr. Wicker?
Aye by proxy.
Mrs. Fisher? No. Mr. Moran?
No.
Mr. Sullivan?
Aye by proxy.
Mrs. Blackburn? Mr. Young?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Budd? Mr. Schmidt? Mr. Vance? Mrs. Capito?
No by proxy.
Ms. Lummis?
Aye by proxy.
Ms. Cantwell?
No.
The noes are 15, the yeses are 12.
The amendment is not agreed to. Senator Cruz, do you have further amendments?
I do. I'd like to call up a Cruz Amendment 1 to S-127. I think all of us are aware that the current condition of the FTC is troubling, to say the least, including with Republican commissioners resigning because they believe the chair is abusing the rule of law. One provision of this bill gives the FTC authority, Section 2 of this bill gives the FTC authority to prohibit, quote, arbitrary, unfair, or deceptive contracts by PBMs. This is a major change from current law. Current law and the language that the FTC has enforced for a long time has prohibited unfair or deceptive conduct. The word arbitrary has never been in there. The FTC for decades has a long-established case law on what qualifies as unfair or deceptive conduct, and that case law has effectively circumscribed the FTC's authority to instances of consumer deception. Adding the word arbitrary to the FTC's power could easily be read as a blanket grant of power that would empower the FTC to regulate on matters far outside its expertise, including matters of pricing. It is unnecessary for what this bill is trying to do, And so my amendment's very simple. It simply strikes the word arbitrary and leaves the standard the same as the standard has been that the FTC has been applying for a decade, which is focusing on unfair or deceptive conduct.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. I'm just making sure. You said Cruz 1, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, wait. Oh, there's a first degree number 1 and a substitute number 1.
I think that's what the confusion is. Do you,
We have not yet. No, it wasn't. We flipped the order, so we haven't voted on the substitute yet. Word arbitrary is the one.
okay, speaking against the amendment, I just want to clarify so that we know which one we're actually voting on. Removing the word arbitrary can result in an additional loophole to the law that would allow PBMs to engage in clawbacks because they would argue that unfairness only applies to consumers and not to pharmacies. So one of the major issues here is the arbitrary nature of how they are clawing back this information. So working with Senator Grassley on this, I would ask our colleagues to oppose this amendment. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Klobuchar?
No.
Mr. Schatz?
No.
Mr. Markey?
No.
Mr. Peters?
No.
Ms. Baldwin?
No.
Ms. Duckworth?
No.
Mr. Tester?
No.
Ms. Sinema?
No.
Ms. Rosen?
No.
Mr. Lujan? Mr. Hickenlooper?
No.
Mr. Warnock?
No.
Mr. Welch?
No.
Mr. Cruz?
Aye.
Mr. Thune?
Aye.
Mr. Wicker?
Aye by proxy.
Mrs. Fisher?
Aye.
Mr. Moran?
No.
Mr. Sullivan?
Aye by proxy.
Mrs. Blackburn?
Aye.
Mr. Young?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Budd?
Aye.
Mr. Schmidt?
Aye.
Mr. Vance?
Aye.
Mrs. Capito?
No by proxy.
Ms. Lummis?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Lujan?
No.
Ms. Cantwell?
No.
The noes are 16, the yeses are 11.
The amendment fails. Senator Cruz, you have a further amendment?
I do. The third and final amendment I'd like to call up is Cruz Substitute Amendment Number 1 to S-127. The hearing we held last month on this issue was helpful. There are real concerns surrounding the business practices of PBMs that warrant further investigation. And right now, the FTC is conducting a serious economic study of PBMs. It's ongoing. One concern that I have with this bill is that it effectively puts the cart before the horse, that it prejudges the results of the FTC study and it assumes the solution before knowing the precise nature of the problem. I think we need to be careful about advancing legislation dramatically expanding the FTC's power and to do so before the agency has even completed the PBM study. My substitute amendment would require the FTC to complete its ongoing study within 18 months. It also broadens the focus of the study to ensure that we get the full economic picture of the supply chain, including consideration of how big pharma companies operate in the supply chain, which is lacking in this legislation. This legislation addresses one piece of the supply chain but doesn't address big pharma. My amendment requires the FTC to focus on a number of key economic questions, including consolidation and competition in the entire prescription drug supply chain, how drug list prices are set by big pharma companies, how PBMs design formularies and rebates, how PBMs affect the adoption of generic and specialty drugs, whether all actors in the prescription drug supply chain are transparent and disclose their information, including the benefits and costs of disclosure, and the PBM's use of clawbacks and direct or indirect remuneration. My amendment directs the FTC to focus on the consumer. We've tended to look at the impacts of PBMs on payments to doctors and to pharmacists, but the person we should ultimately be trying to help is the patient. We want that person to have access to affordable medicines. All of us should want to know these practices by PBMs, but also by big pharma companies and other actors, and how they affect the cost of prescription drugs for the average Americans, as well as their health plan premiums. This committee and Congress would benefit by having data about consumer prices, and I would urge my colleagues to support this amendment and make sure the FTC completes its study before advancing legislation that gives the agency additional power before it has assessed the problem that it's trying to fix.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. Today, average Americans spend over $1,126 per year on prescription drugs, compared to $552 for people in other high-income countries. That's more than double the cost. We know that PBMs can play a positive role, but they are a black box when it comes to the prescription drug market, and manipulation can occur. In fact, 3 PBMs control, as you mentioned earlier, 80% of the market. And because of their market power and lack of transparency and even minimal accountability, they have been getting away with harmful practices that we are now calling out. Senator Grassley and I have looked at this issue for a long time and worked to call for more information, but we also know and are clearly on board with outlining what are manipulative practices so that we can hold them accountable. It is time to give this to the FTC and not just to have a study. I don't know if anybody else has any further comments. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Klobuchar?
No.
Mr. Schatz? Mr. Markey? Mr. Peters? Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Duckworth? Mr. Tester? Ms. Sinema? Ms. Rosen? Mr. Lujan? Mr. Hickenlooper? Mr. Warnock? Mr. Welch? Mr. Cruz? Mr. Thune? Mr. Wicker? Mrs. Fisher? Mr. Moran? Mr. Sullivan? Mrs. Blackburn? Mr. Young? Mr. Budd? Mr. Schmidt? Mr. Vance? Mrs. Capito? Ms. Lummis? Ms. Cantwell?
No.
The noes are 18, the yeses are 9.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments?
Madam Chairman?
Yes, Senator Blackburn.
I'd like to call up Blackburn Amendment 3. And as we call it up, I want to thank Ranking Member Cruz for joining me in this amendment. As you know, FTC Commissioner Wilson will be leaving the agency in the near future. And since Commissioner Phillips has already departed the agency, this is going to leave the FTC with 3 Democrat commissioners and no Republican members. And this is of tremendous concern to me because this agency is supposed to be independent and, as directed by Congress, to be comprised of both majority and minority commissioners. It is especially concerning because the FTC, under Chairman Khan, has a habit of basically going rogue. They're trying to expand their mission. They are trying to move into areas where we do not believe they have the congressional authority. And they're trying to do this, and she is trying to do whatever she wants despite the authority that we have given her. And despite what members of Congress, despite what the courts might say in response to her actions, and having a range of views on the commission ensures appropriate checks and balances on the important issues that this agency considers. So I appreciate your willingness, as well as Senator Grassley's, to engage with me on this bill. I am not comfortable moving this legislation forward without also adding procedural safeguards to prevent the agency from doing what it did in the 1970s. We need to see some restraint at that agency. Senator Cruz has addressed that in his remarks already this morning. Now, in the 70s, Congress stepped in and took steps to rein the agency back in and to cut back its authority because of the regulatory overreach that they were exercising. So I would ask my colleagues to join me in voting for this amendment to make sure the FTC keeps the interest of all Americans, not just the governing party, in mind.
Thank you, Senator Blackburn. And I do expect at some point in time this committee will have a very robust discussion about the FTC and a variety of issues in which we want to see action on and what everyone here on the committee believes their role should or shouldn't be. But the resignation of Commissioners Phillips and Wilson will mean the commission has no Republicans. I look forward to future nominees serving, but their choice to leave should not make the agency powerless to act, particularly against egregious fraud. This amendment would do just that. This amendment would make it possible for commissioners of either party to game the system by simply recusing themselves to delay or prevent votes. This would be an end of a good faith at the FTC, which none of us want. Recently, the FTC took action to prevent child sexual exploitation on a well-known gaming platform. This is exactly the kind of work American consumers are relying on at the FTC, and at the very least, this amendment would have delay of action on these very serious issues. I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment. Senator Klobuchar.
No.
Oh, okay. Any further discussion? If not, clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Klobuchar?
No.
Mr. Schatz? No. Mr. Markey? No. Mr. Peters? No. Ms. Baldwin? No. Ms. Duckworth? No. Mr. Tester? Ms. Sinema? No. Ms. Rosen? No. Mr. Lujan? Mr. Hickenlooper? No. Mr. Warnock? No. Mr. Welch? No. Mr. Cruz? Mr. Thune? Mr. Wicker? Mrs. Fisher? Mr. Moran? Mr. Sullivan? Mrs. Blackburn? Mr. Young? Mr. Budd? Mr. Schmidt? Mr. Vance? Mrs. Capito? Ms. Lummis? Ms. Cantwell? The noes are 14, the yeses are 13.
Amendment is not agreed to. Is there further discussion on the bill as brought before us? Final passage. Further discussion?
Madam Chair, yeah.
Yes, Senator Thune.
I want to acknowledge, I've been trying to understand the pharmaceutical supply chain for a long time. And it's extraordinarily complex relative to other products that we buy in any ordinary marketplace, with lots of players that seem to have been embedded there for a long time. And so I have some skepticism, as I think many others on the committee on both sides of the aisle have, with respect to the role of PBMs. I think that's an issue that we ought to address. They lack transparency, which I think hurts patients and independent pharmacies that many of us represent the most. And so I would argue that we need to take action to tackle the issue of transparency. But I have serious concerns about punting this to the FTC at a time when there won't be a single Republican on the FTC. It'll be 3-0. The only Republican, Christine Wilson, is leaving the FTC. It's a term that doesn't expire until 2025. But she's leaving the FTC because she says the chairman expresses a disregard for the rule of law and due process. Now, it's hard to feature us giving a whole lot more authority to an agency that, as Senator Blackburn has pointed out, has a rogue chairman and not a single representative from our side of the aisle. Now, the United States Senate, in addition to having responsibility to dispense of and deal with legislation, also has a constitutional role to deal with personnel, with the confirmation of key people in key posts in the administration. And it seems to me, at least, that that's the issue that we ought to address before we give a whole load more responsibility to solve what is an extraordinary complex problem, and which is already, as Senator Cruz pointed out, being studied and examined to determine exactly what that problem is and how to fix it. And as I indicated in my previously, this issue, it's somebody who's looked at this for a long time. It doesn't lend itself to real easy solutions. It is complicated. It needs to be carefully studied and examined, and recommendations made. Now, I appreciate what the sponsors of the bill are trying to do, but I think moving it now would be ill-advised, and I don't believe it's responsible for us to transfer a whole bunch of authority and power to an agency which has this kind of problems to start with, and give them even more regulatory authority at a time when I think the FTC is already has its issues to deal with. So let's fix the fundamental problem, which is getting an FTC at least fully complemented and staffed over there with commissioners from representing both sides of the aisle, who will hopefully take a nonpartisan and thoughtful approach to this very important issue. So I'm going to vote no on the final bill, and hope that we can get the FTC in here for a hearing, and hope that we can examine this issue in greater detail at a future time. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Well, Senator Thune, thank you. One of the things about this committee, I think, is we try to work in a bipartisan basis, and your endorsement of maybe that our legislative success is going to move faster than a nominee would move is encouraging, really, on the underlying bill, but I'm not sure that'll happen. I think the legislative process will take some time here, but nonetheless, Senator Grassley and I firmly believe that this is the authority that the FTC needs to do to just properly police the market. Policing the market at this level of concentration, both vertically and horizontally, has created a huge increase in cost. We simply want the FTC to do their job, and this is something that will help us in making sure that the right practices of PBMs are enforced, and the actions that are basically clawing back and putting rural pharmacies out of business, and I should say even urban pharmacies out of business, are closely examined and dealt with. If no other discussion, clerk will call the roll on final passage.
Ms. Klobuchar? Aye. Mr. Schatz? Aye. Mr. Markey? Aye. Mr. Peters? Aye. Ms. Baldwin? Aye. Ms. Duckworth? Aye. Mr. Tester? Aye. Ms. Sinema? No. Ms. Rosen? Aye. Mr. Lujan? Aye. Mr. Hickenlooper? Aye. Mr. Warnock? Mr. Welch? Aye. Mr. Cruz?
No.
Mr. Thune? No. Mr. Wicker?
No by proxy.
Mrs. Fisher? Aye. Mr. Moran? Aye. Mr. Sullivan?
Aye by proxy.
Mrs. Blackburn? No. Mr. Young?
No by proxy.
Mr. Budd? Mr. Schmidt? Mr. Vance? Mrs. Capito? Ms. Lummis?
No by proxy.
Ms. Cantwell?
Aye.
The yeses are 18, the noes are 9.
The legislation is agreed to. I now call on Senator Cruz.
Madam Chair, I move that S66, the NOTAM Improvement Act of 2023, as amended by the Klobuchar-Moran-Capito substitute and Klobuchar 1 and 2, S90, the Informing Consumers About Smart Devices Act, as amended by Lujan 1, as modified, and Markey 1 to Lujan 1, as modified. S. 318, the Save Our Seas 2.0 Amendments Act, as amended by the Sullivan substitute, as modified. And S. 467, the Cadets Act, as amended by Cruz 1, be reported favorably.
Is there a second?
Madam Chairwoman,
Yes, Senator Moran.
I have two amendments to S90 that I intend to offer, and with the agreement of the chair and the ranking member to work with me to the underlying need for a fuller data privacy bill, would withdraw those amendments. I want to protect my opportunity to do so. I'm happy to, now that the motion has been made on S90, I'm procedurally need your assistance in making certain that I can offer those amendments, even though I intend to withdraw them, with an understanding that I have from you and the ranking member to work on broader data privacy legislation.
I'm committed to working on broader data privacy legislation and hearing about your amendments.
But if we vote to approve this legislation, then my opportunity to offer my amendments is,
Would you like,
So could you withdraw the 90 from that motion, allow me to offer my amendments on that bill and take that up separately?
are you saying today, or are you saying to
Yes,
offer
today.
and
No,
withdraw?
today. I think what's happening is that the procedure has gotten ahead of me. I have amendments to offer to S90. We're about to vote on final passage on S90 before I've offered my amendments. A lot of murmuring. I'll withdraw. Madam Chairman, maybe I can make this easier. I can describe my amendments to you and the committee.
Yes.
You can then confirm to me that you will work with me on the issues that we both care about, and I will speak about what I intended to offer rather than what I am offering.
Sounds like a great suggestion, Senator Moran.
Thank you. I like to be the guy who creates the problem but solves his problem.
Thank you. We need more of that. We need more of that. We need more of that.
So, Madam Chairman and my fellow committee members, I agree on S90 with the ranking member and with the chair that Americans have the right to know if products they purchase have the ability to record themselves inside their homes. The goal of informing consumers about Smart Devices Act that we are about to report. But this addresses only a portion of the problem facing consumers. Not only do Americans deserve to know what data of theirs is being collected and how it's being used, but when that data is sensitive in nature, like audio and visual data from inside their homes, they should need to provide consent before that collection and process takes place. I've been working in this committee and a previous member and my ranking member when I chaired the Data Privacy Subcommittee with Senator Blumenthal. We have worked diligently for a bipartisan fix to data privacy legislation. This bill, in my view, is an important and valuable step, but leaves behind data privacy, which American citizens so desperately deserve, and our national security. As we consider TikTok and other legislation, we need a broad data privacy bill adopted by Congress and signed by the President. I have two amendments, or had two amendments, that would accomplish this by inserting language from my earlier data privacy bill, which was drafted with input from privacy advocates and industry stakeholders, Republicans and Democrats. This amendment gives Americans control over their data and the tools necessary to determine how their personal data is used. It also sets a clear national standard which will benefit all stakeholders in this effort. The second amendment that I would have offered simply asked the FTC to report back to us on the problems this bill will address, and critically, what happens to consumer data once it is obtained by these products. Today, our lives are being monitored, evaluated, monetized by new technologies, and the amount of data collected on each of us is increasing every day. That's why I've worked to craft a comprehensive data privacy solution. And I can tell you that in my conversations and negotiations with my colleagues, both Republicans and Democrats, I always say we came this close, so close. I want to see that accomplished, and it should not be in any Senate or any session of the Senate except the one that we are in now. The necessary steps to be taken need to be taken soon. I know that the chair and ranking member understand the importance of this topic, and I will agree to address it later if they will agree to work with me, have their commitment that this committee can get to work on a broader data privacy effort to take seriously our efforts to pass a data privacy law, a bill into law. If you will, I can't offer to withdraw my amendment, but I assume, Madam Chairman and Ranking Member Cruz, that I have your commitment that we will pursue a broader, significant data privacy bill in a continuing bipartisan effort.
Senator Moran, thank you for your leadership on data privacy, and thank you for these amendment issues that are very important to the larger data privacy debate. I think you're bringing up something very important in your specific amendments, and that is that while software may come with a software license agreement, a refrigerator or a microwave that might have a camera or might be recording information doesn't come with such an agreement. And Senator Cruz's legislation is about notification, but you're going further on consent, which is also something I think we need to think about in the framework. And I am very committed to getting a larger data privacy bill. I think that we, if you think about the work that we've done on chips and science, if you think the work we've done on expanding broadband, we also have to have the right framework in the United States, that we have the right privacy protections in place. This is going to give, I think, America the best competitive advantages for the future. So I look forward to working with you on that, and you have my commitment that we will continue to work very diligently on data privacy legislation. Senator Cruz?
And Senator Moran, I would echo what the chair just said. Thank you for your leadership on these important issues. I think all of us agree that privacy is something that is important to our constituents. It's important to the country. I can tell you, in speaking to members of this committee, I've heard from virtually every single member of the committee, both Republican and Democrat, a very serious concern about doing more to protect privacy. I know the chairwoman is committed to that. I certainly am, and so you have my commitment that I look forward to working with you on this issue. And at the same time, I'm glad that we're able to move forward this specific piece of legislation, which will make a meaningful improvement while we come together and work on a much bigger bipartisan bill that goes further in protecting privacy.
Senator Cruz and Chairwoman Cantwell, I thank you both for what you had to say, and I understand the desire to make certain that the issue that I want brought before Congress doesn't intrude upon the ability for the two of you to pass the legislation that this committee is getting ready to pass today. So I want to be helpful to you in your cause, and I appreciate you indicating your help in my cause, although my cause is a cause, as the chairwoman and ranking member said, is a cause of all of us in this room. And having worked on this diligently, legislatively for nearly 3 years, I understand how this legislation could delay yours. But I'm glad to see that you have the necessary desire that we proceed further in the near future. Thank you.
Senator Moran, again, thank you for your leadership on this. Senator Blackburn.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chairman, and I appreciate the amendments he brought forward. I think that I appreciate that he's withdrawing them. As we talk about broader privacy, I think it is so important that we not legislate to a technology. And Madam Chairman, as you appropriately mentioned, with the Internet of Things, it is, there are so many different ways that data is being collected. So I look forward to working with Senator Hickenlooper at our consumer protection data security to work with you and Ranking Member Cruz and make certain that we bring forward a broader privacy bill that will allow individuals to really protect their virtual you.
Thank you so much, Senator Blackburn. Senator Klobuchar. And we're going to vote shortly,
Yes.
so people just stay
Yes,
with it here.
thank you, Madam Chair. I'll put my remarks on the record. I want to thank you and Senator Moran, my co-sponsor, for moving ahead this NOTAM Improvement Act, which we know what happened with the FAA. We want the FAA to upgrade, and our bipartisan legislation is a start. It sets a deadline and also allows for stakeholders to immediately come together to get this done. Thank you.
All those in favor of the motion say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? The motion is agreed to. This legislation is passed. That concludes our markup for this morning in executive session. I want to thank the committee again for your bipartisan work in a diligent fashion. The committee has a lot to do, but it shows that we can continue to work together. So the executive session is adjourned. The Science Transportation Committee will come to order for the purposes of a hearing. We are here this morning at the full committee for improving rail safety in response to the East Palestine derailment. I would ask the witnesses to please join us for the first panel at the witness table.